Yeah, my name is Adi Bukapatnam, and today I have Shoy-cott Chakrabarti with me, who is known for his role as a campaign manager on Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez's campaign back in 2018, and also as her chief of staff. And Shoy-cott has been kind of an architect for progressive policies when it comes to things like the Green New Deal and other policies that affect the working class. So with that, I'd like to welcome you, Shoy-cott. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to talk to me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Of course. So let me just break down a little bit about how this interview will work before we dive into it. I've been long frustrated with the lack of nuance in political discourse in our country. And that's really why I started doing freelance journalism. And one thing I saw is that there's a kind of a conscious effort to separate issues of identity, whether that's with any minority, and with issues of class, right?
Right.
Everyone kind of wants to pretend like race issues are not class issues or gender identity issues are not class issues.
Right.
So today I'm going to ask you about most of your policies, housing, healthcare, etc. I'm going to ask you general questions as well as trans-specific questions. And the reason I chose the trans community as kind of a vehicle for today's conversation is because, first of all, you're running in San Francisco, historically cutting edge when it comes to LGBTQ issues, Harvey Milk and so on. But also because of all the minorities, I think perhaps our political discourse does the most injustice to trans issues. So with that, let's jump in. First, I want to ask you about the elephant in the room, which is you're running against Nancy Pelosi. Right?
Yeah.
She's a juggernaut, and she had the power to make Biden drop out after his horrible debate. She's immensely wealthy through her unethical stock trading, I would say. And progressive challengers in the past, like Shahid Buttar, for example, haven't had much success. Pelosi tends to win her election 70, 80% of the votes sometimes. So how do you plan to tackle Nancy Pelosi?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of answers to this. One is that, she's no longer in a position of power, right? She stepped down as Speaker of the House. A lot of people don't realize this, but she's actually the only member of Congress who's not sitting on any committee right now. So she's not doing any legislating. She hasn't had a town hall in San Francisco for, I think, since at least 2019.
Right.
But beyond that, I ran all these races in 2018, right, which was a similar political moment. Trump had just won. Democrats were really frustrated with the party, and they were really looking for what comes next, or some vision of the future. And in that moment, that sort of appetite for change was what allowed people like AOC and Ayanna Pressley, Ilhan Omar, the squad to win their races. When I look at the appetite for change that exists in the party today, it completely dwarfs anything I saw in 2018. People
Absolutely.
are absolutely furious at the Democratic Party. I mean, if you look at the polling, like the Democratic Party is polling worse than Trump. It's polling below 50% with Democrats, right? And this is sort of bearing out in the campaign I'm running. When I talk to voters at the doors, I do these voter calls every day at noon, and people show up. Most of the people I talk to are lifelong Pelosi voters who respect her, who appreciate the work she's done, but they really realize it's time for something new, time for some sort of change, because clearly whatever has been working, whatever they've been doing in the past decade is not working. Trump just won again. It's not a fluke, right?
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, I don't believe this campaign probably would have been possible, 2 or 4 years ago. I just think this is the right moment for the campaign. I think I'm running on an actual platform of what to do. So that's the right message. And I have an actual background. I'm a serious candidate in this race. So I believe I'm the right candidate for this moment. And I think that's what's going to make the difference.
That's a great answer. And I think you're right. The iron is hot, so to speak. Progressives are kind of having a moment even more so than in 2016. So let me move on to a slightly related question, which is not only about Nancy Pelosi, but Democrats that are similar to her from the establishment. Let's call them corporate Democrats for now. Something that they engage in a lot is performative rhetoric. Right? They fail to deliver on promises. And especially when it comes to issues of minorities, we see this pattern of corporate Democrats playing this identity politics game. Like I said, separating the issues of identity from class. Right. So let me give you a couple of examples and have your thoughts on those. So Pelosi, we know she loves to talk about women's rights, human rights, civil liberties, but she's actively furthering a genocide in Gaza right now. right? She is, when Bernie introduced a resolution to prevent the weapons sale to Israel, she didn't even participate. And when we had the Israel Security Supplemental Appropriations Act and the Israel Security Assistance Support Act, both which would give more money and weapons to Israel, she voted yes on both of those. And just for context, NC Pelosi has taken over $600,000 from the pro-Israeli lobby. So I just want to hear, what are your thoughts about Gaza and Nancy Pelosi's support for it?
Well, I believe that what we're witnessing right now is absolutely a genocide being committed in Gaza, right? I think there's no question about it. And it's being funded with our tax dollars. It's being funded by the US. It's morally reprehensible. Democrats right now are trying to figure out some sort of politically nuanced middle ground to take here. I saw, Pete Buttigieg go on and talk about we have to approach Israel as our friend, while they're committing this genocide. I just think we have to take a clear moral stance and actually play hardball, right? No military aid should be going to this genocide. And I think what you brought up about this general politics of sort of performance politics, right? I think Democrats for a long time have sort of tried to mobilize identity issues as a way to do performative gestures, because the actual solutions to solving these huge challenges that we face, the huge challenges that both minorities face and that we face just overall in society for working people, when it comes to the exorbitant costs of things like healthcare and childcare, while at the same time wages being stagnant for decades, these are monumental challenges that are going to require real big solutions. They're going to require big structural reforms, and Democrats don't want to do that. It's going to piss off their donor class. It's going to piss off the corporations that back them. And so it's much easier for them to just go and do some sort of performance to show what their values are, the kind of virtue signal, rather than actually solve anything. The thing is, though, it's just not working. I think this is why people are voting for people like Donald Trump, right? Like, this is why people are voting even for Obama. Obama ran on big sweeping economic change and people voted for him, right? At the end of the day, people are just really sick of that kind of performance-based politics. Mm-hmm. And they're looking for real ideas and real solutions to tackle these big challenges we have. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, like, the Gaza issue is such a clear version of this, where I'm hearing a lot of talk, from Democrats. I'm hearing a lot of the establishment say, like, yes, it's really, we're really sad about the starvation of children. Well, act like it. If you're really sad about it, then act like it, right? But they're not doing it.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. You mentioned that this is why voters kind of shifted to Trump. I'm a political science nerd, and there is good quantitative observable evidence in political science to show that this kind of neoliberal virtue signaling has a causal effect in the rise of authoritarianism, not just in America, but around the world. So just to dig in a little deeper, when it comes to the issue of race, there was this performative photo shoot that Nancy Pelosi participated in wearing kente cloths during the George Floyd protests. There wasn't a single mention from Nancy Pelosi or her team about changing the way police are trained or addressing systemic issues that Black people face in this in this country. But we saw these kinds of performances. And another recent example, I just spoke to the ACLU of New Jersey about this. Senator Cory Booker, he's co-sponsoring bills like the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which the ACLU has warned the Senate would attack First Amendment rights for Americans and chill pro-Palestinian speech. So what I'm trying to get from you is, what is your political strategy? Like, how are you going to deal with these Democrats when you're actually in office, if you win?
I think we're at a moment right now where there's actually appetite for a wholesale change of the Democratic Party. And I don't think it's just like an opportunity. I think it has to happen. So what I mean by that is, we need to recruit people. This is something I'm trying to do with my campaign. We need to recruit people to run against Democrats all over the country. And we need to create a political atmosphere where just performative acts and non-action is no longer politically viable. And I really think that's possible. I think we just saw Donald Trump completely transform the Republican Party. I think he's governing as a typical kind of corporate Republican who's as corrupt as anybody has ever been in U.S. history. But, he kind of campaigned as this to try to make the Republican Party a working class party. Yeah. And he actually got these, toxic ideas to the Republican Party, like tariffs, to be real. And he created a political environment where the entire Republican Party is having to go along with that, even though they really disagree. So that's the kind of political shift we have to do on the Democratic side. I don't think it should happen with a single individual and a cult of personality the way Donald Trump did it. But I do think we could recruit a movement of, say, dozens or hundreds of people running for office and someone running for president, and create a movement that actually wants to solve these problems. And in that context, it'll be politically toxic to just do performative politics and not actually be a part of trying to solve this stuff. I think it'll get you kicked out of office.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings me to a trans-specific question on this kind of virtue signaling topic, where, trans people face some truly horrible atrocities in this country. There are reports of trans people being raped and murdered as inmates, and especially when it's trans women being forced into cis male prisons. There are reports of transgender people committing or attempting suicide at much higher rates than cisgender people, both amongst trans youth and adults. But the political discourse seems to be focused around, bathrooms, pronouns, and sports, and sometimes, gender-affirming healthcare. And not that these issues aren't important, but, clearly they don't rise to the severity of trans people committing suicide at a very high rate. To talk about issues like these, we have to have a broader conversation about healthcare, criminal justice reform, etc., which means, again, putting your money where your mouth is, right? So do you have a plan to tackle these kind of virtue signaling when it comes to minorities and trans people?
Yeah, I mean, to talk about the broader question first, right, of like, how does this stuff intersect with healthcare? Because what you see in this country, because it is all kind of tied to, class and identity politics are tied, because what you see in the country is when you look at things like health outcomes, if you actually take away the top 10% and top 20%, the top 10 or 20% are actually doing fine. Globally, we're doing okay, have some of the highest life expectancies in the world. It's people in the bottom, 50, 60, 70%. Whose life expectancies are plummeting. And then when you separate that out further and you start looking at the life expectancies of, African Americans, of trans folks, that's even worse, right? And this is the general problem of when you have this very unequal society, within that inequality exists even starker versions of inequality within these minority groups because of discrimination, because of historical redlining, because of all kinds of systemic barriers of racism. And those systemic barriers are things that, if you make money, you can start trying to overcome it a little bit. But even then, there's plenty of evidence that even at higher income brackets, racism exists, against African-American people and against minority groups. But it's really impossible when you're suffering, from poverty or from a situation where you have a low income situation, right? To dial in on the question of, health for trans folks, I think this is one of those places where the Republicans have decided to just create a wedge issue around, trans people in sports or bathrooms or whatever. It's not even bathrooms anymore because they realize that's a losing battle. And Democrats, instead of us, vocally affirming why we have to actually defend trans people, talking about the fact that suicide rates are so high, actually presenting the evidence of this is a real problem. Trans people are being oppressed. They are struggling in a lot of ways and they're being attacked. That Democrats have this instinct to just like run away in fear and to just kind of slightly adopt the Republican position and hope they don't have to talk about it. It comes down to the fact that they don't really care about trans lives. Like this is not an issue that they want to actually engage on and really come up with real solutions. We do have to fight for gender affirming care for trans people. We know that works to try to reduce suicide rates amongst trans people, right? And at the end of the day, like, we need to actually, I think it's beyond that. We actually have to advocate and talk about how this is an important issue and why it's an important issue at a larger level, and allow, the entire fight for trans rights to be boiled down to just trans people in sports or not, right? It's so dehumanizing to turn it into that. And then just say, like, if I take the exact right position on this, I'm good. No, that's not how it works, right? We have to actually, to include everyone in society, we have to fight for everyone's rights.
Yeah, and by ignoring these major issues, Democrats kind of give Republicans ammunition to just dismiss these issues as silly or, as inconsequential. So let's dive into Medicare for All. I'll give you the general and the trans context and have your thoughts. So it's no secret that the healthcare lobby is one of the most powerful in the country. Even after the whole Mangione issue, and countless other scandals, honestly. United Health stock just surged 14% again just last week, you know? Nothing seems to stop this industry or the politicians that take their money. So how do you plan on passing Medicare for all in this environment? And to give you the trans context again, specifically when it comes to mental health care, according to a CDC report, trans youths, 1 out of every 4 have attempted suicide, according to this report. And when it comes to trans adults, 82% had seriously considered suicide in their lifetime, and 40% have actually attempted it. These are just staggering numbers. So what can you tell me about Medicare for all and mental health care?
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to get Medicare for all passed unless we get rid of the influence of the health insurance lobby
Yeah.
in our country, right? We talked about United Health stock going up 14%. That happened in part because United Health just was allowed to do a merger with the second largest home health care provider in the country, right? And
Yeah.
this is after United Health actually in 2023 they bought the third largest provider of home health care. So they're just expanding. And how are they being allowed to do this? Well, United Health's lobbyist is actually the former employer of Pam Bondi. And so they have a lobbyist that's one of the closest lobbyists to the White House right now. It's just total pay for access based politics. And this is not just something that Trump invented. This is the way lobbying and access in DC has been going on for decades, right? You pay money, you get lobbyists. I remember when I went into AOC's office on the first day that we were doing our sort of inauguration celebration, a T-Mobile lobbyist showed up and tried to talk to me, and he showed me a map of all the T-Mobile offices in our district, and it was like almost like a subtle threat. It's like, these are the people we employ in our district. If you don't talk to us, we don't know what'll happen to them, right? I was just like, screw off, right? No, that's not how we engage and negotiate. That's not how you engage. But that's how it works, and the only way to defeat that is if we have to have candidates who go into office, who get into power not through that money, right? So they're not beholden to the health insurance lobbyists. They're beholden to a movement of people who got them there. But I totally believe that's possible. And I actually think, it's not only is it possible, that's the only way we save the Democratic Party. This is the real fight that's going on right now. There is a wing of the Democratic Party that believes their power comes from keeping, the corporate money coffers coming their way. And there's another wing of the party that's saying, no, that way failed. That's why we have Trump right now. We actually need to go in and fix these problems. And right now, the health insurance lobby is standing in the way of that, right? So that's what we have to do. That's the big challenge ahead of us. So I don't think it's going to happen by me going in there and negotiating with these lobbyists and with these corporate-backed Democrats. We have to replace them and threaten their power. But when it comes to attaching this to the larger question of healthcare for trans individuals, I think it's, again, Democrats are coming at this from a place of fear. And I think this is tied to the issue of why Democrats keep wanting to go back to the corporate coffers, is they're so afraid of what might happen in this new world. What would happen if we actually had a new world where we passed Medicare for all, where we really defended trans rights, where we really defended, the rights of all people in this country, and tried to shoot for that kind of a big goal? It's such a departure from where we are that I think a lot of Democrats just think, oh no, that might go wrong. We can't go that way. But I think we're just at a point where we have to, or we're just slow walking into dystopia for the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah. Let's transition here a little bit to the environment. I know you were one of the core architects of the Green New Deal. It was central to AOC's campaigns and policy platforms. One of the things that I found most moving about the Green New Deal is that it's not just about the environment. It's very similar to FDR's New Deal in the sense that it targets multiple issues like employment, like the economy, like inflation. It is too often the conversation around the Green New Deal is wishy-washy. Nancy Pelosi has dismissed it as the green dream or whatever. So can you tell us a little bit more about the policy and how it can, have multiple roles to play in our country?
Yeah, the premise of the Green New Deal, really, because if you look at the context in which we launched it, it was at a time when the discussion around climate change was just around, stopping fossil fuel infrastructure or like a tax on carbon. And then the idea was, if you just if we put a tax on carbon, then magically we'll build a clean energy economy. And our whole idea was like, actually, no. If you look at the history of countries that have managed to transform their societies, have managed to create a middle class and a bunch of wealth for a broad base of their society, it never happened through some like small policy tweak. It
Yeah.
always happened by these countries taking on a big mission. They're making comprehensive plans to totally transform the economy, building institutions out of finance and execute those plans, having a kind of leadership that will drive it. And so the Green New Deal was saying the last time we did something like that in America was actually when we completely converted our economy over to a war economy during World War II. Now, we're not saying we need to create a war economy today, but that transition to a war economy in World War II built our entire industrial base. It built the middle class. It built so much wealth that was the basis of America's prosperity for the next several decades. Now, what we're saying with the Green New Deal is climate change is our chance to actually build that kind of wealth again. That's the way to actually get us unstuck and get us out of stagnation. Because if we take on this big project of upgrading our entire economy, because these clean energy, technologies, they're really like the next version, the next upgrade to all the old, dirty technologies we have today. It's sort of like how we transitioned from whale oil at some point to fossil fuels. Well, now it's time to transition from fossil fuels to electricity, and that'll make society cleaner. It'll tackle climate change, and in the process, it'll give us the cause to build out tons and tons of high wage, high value jobs, which will create tens of millions of high wage jobs in America and get us out of this economic stagnation that we're in right now as well. And I think this economic stagnation is, at the end of the day, the reason why we're getting these elections that go into authoritarians, because it is easy in a moment of economic stagnation for an authoritarian to come up and say, you know what, I alone can come in here and fix it. Democracy is the problem. Let's just get rid of all this, this messy democracy stuff and give me power to like solve all your problems. Which of course is never how it works. But that's why I think the Green New Deal is how you solve, our economic stagnation, climate change, and the trend towards authoritarianism in the country.
Yeah. And I think that's a trend amongst progressive policy and Dem socialist policy in general is it has to be intersectional. There's no way around it because the environment is going to touch jobs. It's going to touch climate change. It's going to touch war, many different issues. So you kind of have to have a holistic policy surrounding it. So let me just ask you about criminal justice for a second. It's no secret that America has the highest incarceration rates in the world. As someone who wants to be public defender, this issue is close to my heart. And to give you the trans context of this issue, there's a report from the Indiana Journal of Law and Social Equality, as well as the UCLA Journal of Gender and Law, telling us of disturbing practices called V-coding, right? Where corrections officers and administration force trans women to share cells with cis men that are known for aggression, sexual violence. And, these trans people have reported being abused and raped for months on end, like just living a life of threat and anxiety constantly when they're, in the prison system. And much of this has to do with putting trans women into male prisons, right? So can you talk to me a little bit about your criminal justice reform? And I have another specific example I'd like to talk to you after I hear your answer.
Yeah, I mean, in general, right, the US has a prison system that's focused on punishment and not at all focused on any sort of rehabilitation or figuring out how to get people back out of prison and into society. One of the largest causes of people going into jail is just recidivism, right? We have no programs to get people out of jail and let them actually live a life, let them participate in the economy. And so you have a situation where folks who might have gone into jail from, say like drug selling charges, that's the only job available to them when they get back out of jail because we're not giving them any other opportunity. And again, this is one of those situations where our jail system is itself such a punishing kind of environment that in that sort of environment, folks who are minorities have it hardest, right? Like it doesn't surprise me what you said about trans people having such a difficult time in jail because it's set up to be kind of a survival of the fittest kind of environment, and many jails are run this way, as and it's absolutely horrific, right? It's a human rights violation in many cases. And when it comes to criminal justice reform, I think a lot of this, it's the entire system. Like it starts with, we actually need to figure out how to switch our mindset of jails to not be a place where you just cage people up, but how do you actually get people out of there and get them back into society and rehabilitate them, right? And then all the way up to like, how do we police in a way where we're not over policing, right? And we're not just
Yeah.
we're not just throwing people in jail for minor infractions, and we're not just throwing people, stopping people all the time. There's tons and tons of solutions out there through the whole criminal justice reform movement for how to do all this right. But what we lack is any political will to tackle it, right? There's this idea that we saw a little bit of uptick in certain kinds of crime during the pandemic, and everybody freaked out and thought we should just throw out all the criminal justice reform stuff and we should just do a tough on crime strategy. But that doesn't work.
Yeah.
That's not actually how we solve this problem at its root. At the end of the day, we have to invest. We have to fix the system. But then, of course, beyond that is the real solution to all of this is actually creating a society where we have more equality. We have a basic social safety net. We don't have people, falling into desperation just because they miss a month of their rent check, or they have a healthcare emergency, right?
Yeah.
We need to actually take care of people.
Yeah. So my next question is related, and it's also to do with how, as a congressman, you'll deal with local authorities, right? So Kamala Harris was both District Attorney of California and Attorney General of California. And while she held those positions, there were some truly shocking stories coming from the criminal justice field. For example, in 2015, The Guardian reported that a trans woman, Carmen Guerrero, who was in a California medical facility, actually, was killed by her cellmate despite the officers having multiple warnings. In April 2017, a transgender woman was found dead in her cell at Salinas Valley State Prison. As Attorney General and District Attorney, Kamala Harris had the power to do something about not forcing trans women into male prisons, but she didn't use that power. So how will you hold people that are, kind of under your purview in the sense that they're in San Francisco, but they're state employees and they're state politicians, people in the public view? How will you deal with that when you're a congressman?
Yeah, I mean, this is a place where my approach is really going to differ from Nancy Pelosi's, because Nancy Pelosi has really stayed out of the fray of anything local for years. And, she both hasn't engaged with her constituents for years. She hasn't done town halls, and she's really stayed out of trying to influence. Other than like her machine politics, she influences the campaigns, but she's really stayed out trying to say anything about anything going on locally in San Francisco. I just think we're at a place where national politics is local, right? And a big job, I believe, of local elected officials is to defend marginalized folks, especially in a moment where Trump is, sending ICE agents out onto the streets and picking people up, right? And I think one of the ways we fight back against that is by having elected officials show up and confront ICE agents on the steps of the court, for example. And so I do see it as my job as a congressperson to basically use my platform to shine a spotlight on places where people are being ignored, right? And people's rights are being violated, and try to put pressure on local officials to do something about it when I can.
I appreciate that answer because it's an old adage, all politics are local. And I truly believe that because it's horrible to see how little influence sometimes people in DC can have on their constituents. Let's move on to a massive issue in San Francisco, and it's housing and affordability.
Right.
It's no secret that, it's extremely expensive to live in San Francisco. The median home value is around 1.4 million, I believe. Rents are 70% higher than the national average. So how would you address this crisis? And I'd like to hear about this Reconstruction Finance Corporation you're talking about, because it seems interesting.
Yeah, I think a lot of the focus on trying to fix the crisis of housing in San Francisco and in the country recently has been around kind of regulatory reform, things like zoning reform, permit reform. And I'm not saying that stuff's unimportant, but if you actually talk to nonprofit housing developers, affordable housing developers, a huge issue is just financing, and it's just like the larger macroeconomic environment. There's so many projects that just get stalled for decades because they can't get the money to build the housing that's necessary. So the idea around the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, this is a larger project that I worked on at New Consensus over the last several years. It's recreating this this agency that existed during the New Deal and World War II. It was a government-owned corporation called the RFC that was at one point the largest corporation in the world by assets under management. And the job of the RFC there's kind of like this public bank and a VC and an investor and also this project manager that was a proactive unit or proactive like muscle of the government that went out and made sure things that we wanted to get built actually got built. It's larger than just for housing. We used it during World War II to build out supply chain, build out all kinds of industries that we needed to build. But
Yeah.
in the context of housing, what I imagine is, say we've got an affordable housing development that's been stuck in development hell for years. The RFC would be the agency that goes in there and really fixes it and has every tool at its disposal to make sure it happens. If it's just like we need to have lower interest rates, sure, it can do low interest rate financing. But if the
Yeah.
problem is there's no developer coming in to actually build this housing because it's not profitable enough or whatever, then the RFC can have a public developer that comes in and builds the housing directly, right? It's kind of a jack of all trades executive agency that'll make sure things happen. And I think that at the end of the day, that's the problem we have in San Francisco is we just don't have enough affordable housing getting built to allow working people to continue living in the city.
Yeah. And obviously, I think, that's an overarching plan that would help everyone. But just to give our listeners some trans-specific context, Teen Vogue reported that 22% of trans high schoolers have experienced homelessness, compared to only 3% of cisgender high schoolers. Just to ask you about some of the other policies as well, which would make San Francisco more affordable, you mentioned childcare essential services. So can you address that issue?
Yeah, I think childcare is another situation where costs are just skyrocketing nationwide, and all these issues really they're happening all over the country, but they're really acute in San Francisco. And one of the themes I'm really trying to push with my campaign is the idea that these are not San Francisco specific problems. They're really bad in San Francisco because our level of unaffordability and our inequality is so bad.
Yeah.
But they're really problems that we have to tackle at a national level. It's just gotten to a point where it's a breaking point, right? And the city's not going to be able to tackle it on its own. So, I call for universal childcare. I think we've got to move to a system where the government is directly funding childcare centers, and there's plenty of proposals for the details of how to actually do it. There's a model in Denmark that I think works really well, where they kind of plan out actual childcare centers, on a block by block basis. But there's other ways we could do it, where it's just funding existing centers and making sure that we have a way to control the prices on this while ensuring everybody has access to it.
Right.
And obviously Zoran's running on it, and New York is just basically doing universal daycare, right? And that's I think a simpler model. But we have to go to universal childcare for the whole country. Is the kind of thing that's really difficult for a city or a state other than maybe New York City to fund, because it's such a massive program, and I think the federal government has to do it. The other place where affordability, when I talk about affordability in the city, it's housing, healthcare, childcare, and utilities, kind of in that order. And because our utility costs, people don't realize this, are going out of control in San Francisco. And now it's happening all over the country. Utility rates have skyrocketed over the past 5 years. There's a lot of reasons for this, but a simple solution for San Francisco is to move towards public power. So Sacramento, which is just a few miles north of us, they have municipal power and they pay 40% less in utility bills than we do. In San Francisco, it's surprising. People don't realize this, but San Francisco, we own our own dam. We have Hetch Hetchy Dam. And part of the deal for buying that dam was there was a federal law passed that required San Francisco to have federal power or public power. But through the process, PG&E somehow got mixed up in there. PG&E is our utility, our investor-owned utility, and they own all the distribution lines. And they're just slow walking, selling the stuff back to the city. So this is actually a place where, as a federal lawmaker, I can threaten to enforce that federal bill that passed, many years ago, and push PG&E to come to the table and negotiate and get San Francisco to own its own power, because we already generated it ourselves. So we shouldn't be paying these crazy rates.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's absolutely right that focusing on these issues of affordability and making life cheaper for San Francisco residents is the way forward, because San Francisco is notorious in terms of providing the Republicans ammunition for saying, hey, look at these Democrat cities which are failing in terms of affordability, housing, and all these other areas. What do you have to say about that kind of attacks on Democratic cities? It is true that places like New York, San Francisco, LA are extremely unaffordable. Where does the blame go?
My view is the blame goes to the very top, because I think all these cities are kind of a canary in the coal mine for the rest of the country. Because if you look at it, affordability is getting worse in the cities. Like, we kind of got there first because cities became unaffordable first, but it's happening all over the country now. You know, like if you look at the Sun Belt, which for so long was, you know, the place for cheap housing, and there's lots of housing construction going on, prices there are starting to go up, right? If you look at places in Texas like Austin or you know, Dallas, prices there are going up. Right? We just haven't done these structural changes necessary to be able to tackle these problems. Like we've lost that entire muscle of government where we actually say, okay, housing prices are going up. What do we do to start building more affordable housing? We don't have a way to execute that federally. We've kind of dissolved all our federal power to do it, and cities and states are not capable of handling it on their own. And so we just kind of like let it continue getting worse slower and slower over time. But now it's at a breaking point, right? Now people are saying this is way too bad, and we're just going to vote for whoever's willing to blow up the whole system.
Yeah.
And and so yeah, I think it's just decades of negligence is really what it boils down to, and it's not accidental negligence. It's negligence of our politicians who got bought out by corporations that profit off of this negligence, right? It's
Yeah.
crazy. Housing costs are great for a landlord and rentier class, and for companies like Blackstone and BlackRock that are just buying up houses and renting them and letting rents keep going up, right?
That makes a lot of sense. You know, on that issue, San Francisco is obviously home to many, many wealthy people, you know, including yourself. You're a self-made millionaire, I believe, right? And you proposed tax increases. Can you explain the different, levels of taxation and what that means in terms of dollars?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different tax increases I support. I'd say the big one that I'm talking about that most people don't talk about is actually doing a wealth tax. So I have a proposal on my site, and there are bills out there. Bernie and Elizabeth Warren both have bills to propose wealth taxes, but I have a proposal for a wealth tax of just 2% on wealth over $50 million, which is, I think, very reasonable. It's no one's going to be, you know, hurting for food if they have less than $50 million, and then 3% over $1 billion. And this is just part of like what I think needs to be a larger tax package, because I think the other stuff needs to be tied to what we're actually going to do. So, for example, for Medicare for All, Bernie's got a great proposal for how to fund Medicare for All, which will result in slightly more taxes, but no more health insurance costs, right? For most people, you'll be paying, I believe the calculation was about half of what you currently pay to your health insurance company in taxes. But what I believe the wealth tax increase is necessary to just start, you know, getting money back into the coffers of the government to be able to fund all the social services that we depend on, and also to start tackling this crazy inequality that we have in our society, which I do think is a problem. You know, I saw this chart recently that I think it's 50% of all consumer spending was done by the top 10% or maybe the top 1%. So whenever you have this so much wealth concentrated in the hands of so few people, it totally distorts the market. So if 50% of all spending is being done by the small group of people, that means that the market will only be building things for that small group of people, right? It doesn't make sense to be building things at the low end of the market that other people can afford, and so that's a huge problem. And I think that's why we actually do need to decrease our wealth inequality in this country.
Yeah. And that brings us to the huge issue of Citizens United. And I want to have a slightly nuanced conversation about this because I know progressives talk about having a constitutional amendment to overturn the decision.
Yeah.
But now, equipped with a law degree and having spoken to the ACLU and things like this, I see the legal hurdles that Citizens United faces. For example, there have been attempts to improve disclosure when it comes to who your financiers are. And the New York affiliate of the ACLU has fought back against that, saying that it chills free speech. But as we know, what Citizens United does is it equates money to speech and it equates corporations to people. So when the wealthy have this increased free speech, it actually chills the free speech of the many who can't afford to throw millions of dollars into political campaigns. But the legal issues are there because the Supreme Court decision is there. It is a huge uphill battle. And even organizations like the ACLU will fight against you when you're doing this. So what is the plan to do this?
So I'd say there's things we can do that's not a full overturn of Citizens United, because I agree that is a big hurdle. Though I'd start by saying I think it's a hurdle, but I think we're actually at a point in our country's history where these are the kinds of things we actually should be shooting for. You know, like overturning Citizens United, getting rid of the influence of money in politics is really popular. It's a bipartisan issue. There's no reason why this can't be overturned, you know, other than just the politics of it and the people in power, you know, don't want it to happen. So I actually do think there's a path to getting there, because I think if there's anything the last decade has taught us, our politics is in a crazy moment. Anything can happen right now. So I think if anything, like if we're not shooting for the big final ultimate goal, we're probably shooting too low. And so that's my view on that. But even if we can't get there, what Citizens United did is it didn't actually mandate that we need unlimited corporate money. That was decided in a different case called Speech Now. And Speech Now has never been litigated in front of the Supreme Court, and it's actually being contested right now in Maine. So Maine passed a ballot initiative saying we want to limit contributions to super PACs, and that's being challenged. And Larry Lessig's organization called Citizen Equality, I think, is fighting that battle right now. And kind of the argument there, since you have a law degree, I'm going to go into details here, but the argument there is, the whole idea of unlimited money into super PACs was it sort of was accepted because the idea was super PACs can't coordinate, so there's no quid pro quo. But recently, there's been many examples of candidates actually benefiting directly from super PACs, and the New Jersey senators going to jail for that reason,
Right.
partially for that reason right now.
Yeah.
So that's a legal battle. I think even if we don't get that, we can do public financing of elections. There's nothing that's prohibiting that. We can do something like the dollar matching system that states like New York and Washington do, which at least amplify the dollars that grassroots donors put into campaigns. And that's a way to sort of curb the amount of influence that the corporate money is having in elections. I'd be a big supporter of that. But ultimately, I do think the easiest way to try to get public will on this is to shoot for the big, simple, easy fix, which is we just say corporations are not people, corporate money is not people's money. We should have federally mandated limits on how much can be donated into any election. And people would like it because people get hating spam for donation links for 2 years. Actually, it's full time now. It's 24/7. Every single election cycle, people are getting hit up with ads for money. So I think we've got big public support here, so we should shoot for it.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I mean, you have a substantive plan forward to tackle it despite the hurdles. So that's all I have for you today, Shoy-cott. I appreciate your candidness. I thought you were giving me very honest answers. I thank you for your time. And if you can just stick around for a couple of minutes.
All right. Thanks, Adi.
Hey there. If you liked that video, then subscribe to my channel. Click on the link in my bio to follow me on Instagram, X, and more.